Right now, as you are watching this, a 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran is ticking down toward expiration on April 21st. That is days from now, and the entire planet is holding its breath. Because what happens in these next few days doesn't just determine whether bombs start falling again over Tehran. It determines who runs the Middle East, who controls the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, who gets to call themselves the world's indispensable power, and whether a nuclear shadow grows darker over every single one of us. And here is the thing that should wake you up right now. Russia is the one sitting at that table with a plan, not us. Russia. Moscow has formally offered to store Iranian highly enriched uranium on its own territory as a key part of a nuclear deal. Think about what that means. While Washington sent J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff to Islamabad for 21 hours of talks that ended without a single agreement, Vladimir Putin is quietly positioning himself as the man with the exit ramp, the man with the solution, the man the world turns to when America either can't or won't close the deal. And that silence from Washington, that absence of a clear, unified American strategy, is not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and in geopolitics, when America goes quiet, somebody else fills that space. Tonight, that somebody is Russia. Let's back all the way up and build this picture properly, because this story didn't start last week. It didn't start with the ceasefire announcement on April 8th. This story has been building for years, layer by layer, decision by decision, miscalculation by miscalculation. And understanding where we are right now requires understanding every single one of those layers. The Trump administration had pressed Iran to completely dismantle its nuclear and missile programs, a demand that Iran refused. And when diplomacy hit that wall, the United States and Israel chose war. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched large-scale strikes on Iran, beginning what is now called the 2026 Iran War. The attacks included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader Khamenei, as well as the assassination of Ali Larijani, a key figure in negotiations. Let that sink in for a moment. The supreme leader of Iran, gone. One of the most consequential political figures in the entire Middle Eastern chessboard, gone. And yet the war didn't end. Iran didn't collapse. The missiles kept flying, the drones kept launching, and the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed, threatening the energy supply lines that power the global economy. The White House stated that the objectives of Operation Epic Fury were to destroy Iran's ballistic missile arsenal and production capacity, and its navy, sever its support for proxies in other countries, and ensure Iran can never acquire a nuclear weapon. Those are sweeping, enormous objectives. And here is the question that military strategists and foreign policy analysts have been asking since the very first bombs dropped. How do you actually achieve all of that? How do you bomb away nuclear knowledge? How do you airstrike away the institutional memory of a country's scientific program? Airstrikes are undoubtedly reducing the number of Iranian ships and missile launchers, but they cannot erase Iran's nuclear know-how. Nor can they eliminate Iran's elusive drone force or its readily concealable arsenal of mines, fast attack patrol ships, torpedoes, and other means of attacking transportation routes and critical infrastructure on which the Persian Gulf states and the world economy depend. This is the trap. This is the thing that nobody in Washington seems to want to say out loud. You can bomb infrastructure, you can assassinate leaders, you can impose a naval blockade, which is exactly what Trump ordered after the Islamabad talks collapsed. But you cannot bomb an idea out of existence. You cannot blockade a country's determination. And Iran's determination, whatever else you think about that government, has proven to be extraordinary. The war has killed more than 4,000 people across the Middle East, overwhelmingly in Iran and Lebanon. 4,000 people dead. And the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow passage through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows, remains contested. The 2026 U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran and Tehran's near closure of the Strait of Hormuz are causing what analysts describe as the largest disruption of modern energy flows, proving the world has never escaped the reality of oil geopolitics. Every time you fill up your gas tank right now, every time you look at prices at the grocery store, you are feeling the physical consequence of this war in your wallet. This isn't abstract. This is happening to American families every single day. So where does Russia fit into all of this? Because Russia's role in this crisis is one of the most fascinating, complicated, and frankly underreported dimensions of this entire story. Russia's ambassador to the United Kingdom told CNBC that Russia has a lot of sympathy with Iran and questioned the Trump administration's exit strategy from the Middle East crisis. Now, on the surface, that sounds like Russian propaganda, and some of it certainly is. But beneath that diplomatic language is a very real strategic calculation that Moscow has been running for months. Vladimir Putin has numerous incentives to play peacemaker. Doing so would bolster Russia's prestige and influence on the world stage. And while Moscow is currently benefiting from the short-term windfall of higher energy prices, those benefits will diminish if the world slides into a prolonged recession and global demand for oil and gas declines for an extended period. You have to sit with that for a second because it is actually a remarkably clear-eyed analysis of Russian self-interest. Putin benefits from chaos, but only up to a point. A global recession wipes out the energy windfall that has been keeping Russia's war economy afloat. A prolonged Middle East conflict that sends oil prices spiraling and crashes global demand is ultimately bad for Moscow, too. So Russia has a genuine, if entirely self-interested, reason to want this war to end. And here is what makes Russia uniquely positioned to broker that ending. Russia has long had a robust diplomatic presence in Tehran and extensive contacts in Iran's military and security circles. As a major energy producer, Russia has deep relationships with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf energy powers. Moreover, Putin has met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dozens of times over the past decade, far more often than he has met with most world leaders. Think about the diplomatic footprint that represents. Russia has relationships on every single side of this conflict, with Iran, with the Gulf states, with Israel. That is an extraordinarily rare position, and one that the United States right now simply does not occupy with the same depth or credibility. Iranian officials previously said mistrust in the U.S. has been high ever since Trump withdrew the United States from the Obama-negotiated Iran nuclear deal in 2018. That withdrawal, that single decision made years ago, is now costing America dearly. Because when you break an agreement, people remember. When you tear up a deal that took years to negotiate and walk away, the other side draws a lesson. And the lesson Iran drew from 2018 was, you cannot trust American promises. Which is why, even now, even in the middle of a ceasefire, even as Pakistani mediators shuttle between capitals and Vance flies to Islamabad, the Iranians are not fully convinced that any deal they sign with Washington will hold past the next election cycle, or even past the next news cycle. Trump officials proposed a 20-year suspension in Iranian uranium enrichment during the Islamabad talks on Saturday, which Iranian negotiators countered with a proposal for a 5-year suspension that the U.S. rejected. American negotiators also reportedly want Iran to dismantle its major nuclear enrichment facilities and hand over more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. So the gap between what Washington is demanding and what Tehran is willing to offer is not small. It is not a bridgeable distance that a few more hours of talks can close. It is a fundamental disagreement about the future of Iran as a sovereign state, about whether Iran gets to maintain any civilian nuclear capability at all, or whether this war ends with Iran stripped of technology it spent decades developing. After 21 hours of negotiations, the talks concluded without a resolution. White House spokesperson Olivia Wales stated that the Iranians chose the pursuit of a nuclear weapon over peace, adding that Trump has already ordered a naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz and keeps all additional options on the table. That is the White House framing. Iran chose weapons over peace. But Iran's parliament speaker, who led Tehran's delegation, told a very different story. He said Iran raised forward-looking initiatives, but that the U.S. had failed to gain the trust of his delegation in the talks. 2 delegations, 2 completely different accounts of what happened in that room. And somewhere in the gap between those 2 accounts lives the truth of how close or how far we actually are from a resolution. Now, here is where Russia's offer becomes genuinely significant, not just as diplomatic theater, but as a potentially real off-ramp. Moscow has offered to store Iranian highly enriched uranium on its own territory as a key part of a nuclear deal. The Iranians no longer fully trust Trump's own envoys, and in this context, Washington should consider Russia's offer to help broker a compromise deal. This is the argument being made by serious foreign policy analysts, not Russian propaganda outlets, but people like the former director of the CIA's Russia analysis. The argument is this: if the core problem is verification and trust, and if Iran doesn't trust American promises, then you need a third party that Iran does trust to hold the keys. And right now, that third party is Russia. Former Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif's proposed bargain centers on Iran, accepting constraints on its nuclear activities, and fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz in return for comprehensive sanctions relief, including a U.S.-Iran mutual non-aggression pact, terms he argues the United States could never secure by military means. There it is. That is the actual shape of a potential deal. Iran gives up the bomb, or at minimum the most weaponizable material, and opens the strait. America lifts sanctions and provides security guarantees, and Russia potentially serves as the custodian and guarantor that makes the whole thing credible to Tehran. But here is the problem with that elegant framework, and it is a big problem. The ceasefire that went into effect on April 8th is fragile. Netanyahu said the U.S. broke off talks after concluding Iran violated the ceasefire agreement by failing to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. J.D. Vance called it a fragile truce. Fragile truces have a way of shattering, and the window for diplomacy is genuinely narrow. All parties still believe a deal is possible, and mediators hope that narrowing the gaps could enable another round of negotiations before the ceasefire expires on April 21st. April 21st. That is the deadline. And every day that passes without a second round of substantive talks is a day closer to the moment when someone, either the U.S., or Iran, or Israel acting independently, decides that words have run out. There is also the question of what this crisis is doing to America's standing in the world, because you have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture here. The United States went to war in Iran with sweeping objectives and a stated confidence that military power could resolve what diplomacy could not. Russia's ambassador asked pointed questions about the Trump administration's exit strategy, and his comments came as the U.S. and Israeli-led war appeared poised to enter its third week of a conflict with no clear endpoint in sight. An exit strategy. That is the question. Not just what are we trying to achieve, but how do we get out? How does this end in a way that America can call a victory, that Iran can survive, that the region can stabilize, and that the rest of the world can return to something resembling normal? The United States and Iran are trapped in a conflict in which each new escalation only deepens a shared losing predicament. Neither can compel the other's surrender. Sooner rather than later, both will confront the urgency of finding an off-ramp, one that does not hinge on the other's humiliation. Any viable exit will require each side to claim a measure of victory. Read that again. Neither side can compel the other's surrender. That is not a statement from an Iranian state media outlet. That is the considered judgment of serious strategic thinkers looking at the military and political landscape with clear eyes. And meanwhile, the American people are not fully in this story yet, not the way they need to be. The Strait of Hormuz, the enriched uranium stockpiles, the Russian mediation offer, the naval blockade, the ceasefire expiration, these are not abstractions. These are the pressure points that could, within days, either move toward resolution or toward a new and more devastating phase of a war that has already killed thousands of people and disrupted the global economy in ways we are all already feeling. The nuclear issue is likely to determine not only when the war ends, but also how it ends, and who can claim victory. Who can claim victory? That is the question sitting at the heart of all of this. Because this war, like most wars, is ultimately about narratives as much as it is about bombs and uranium stockpiles. Trump needs to be able to say he eliminated the Iranian nuclear threat. Iran needs to be able to say it survived and maintained its sovereignty. Russia needs to be able to say it was indispensable to the peace. And the rest of the world, like the Gulf states, Europe, China, Pakistan, needs to be able to say the strait is open and the energy flows are restored. Can all of those things be true at once? Can a deal be constructed that lets every major player walk away with enough of what they need to sell it at home? That is the diplomatic puzzle that is sitting on the table right now, with days left on a fragile ceasefire clock, with a naval blockade in place, with Russia making offers that Washington hasn't publicly accepted or rejected, and with a world economy that cannot afford another round of escalation. The silence from Washington on Russia's offer is not just a policy gap. It is a statement. And what that silence says, or what it risks saying, is that the United States would rather keep fighting than let Vladimir Putin get credit for the peace. That is a deeply human political calculation. It is also potentially a catastrophic one. Because if ego and optics prevent the one diplomatic arrangement that has the credibility to actually work, then we are choosing more war for the sake of appearances. And the people who pay the price for that choice are not the policymakers. They are the 4,000 already dead, the families on both sides of this conflict, and the American families who will keep paying more at the pump and the grocery store while the men with power argue about who gets the credit. What happens in the next 72 hours matters. Watch it closely.